I want to welcome you to our Lunch and Learn session today, and thank you for taking time out of your day and perhaps your lunch to join us for the next hour. So please know that we are recording the session. You would have just heard that through Zoom, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll send out a link after the session. So I'm just going to start with some housekeeping for our session. So there are over 400 participants registered for today's talk. So in order to make sure that all our technology runs smoothly, we're just disabling all of your microphones and cameras, but we will spotlight our panelists during their conversations, so you should not have to make any adjustments to your screen. And we have a support team in the background, so please hold tight. If we have any unexpected interruptions, like a Zoom bomber or something, and our team will do their very best to promptly address any issues. Okay, so moving to our next slide. So I want to start our time together today by recognizing and acknowledging the land we're meeting on. I know there are people on this call that are from various geographical locations, so our participants may reach across the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. And honoring the land we are on and the footsteps that have walked these lands before us grounds us and acknowledges the importance of relationships. So I want to acknowledge the land on which I am currently standing and the wisdom and footsteps that have marked it for generations. I encourage you to do the same. So the place where I live and I join you from today is acknowledged to be the territory covered by Treaty 6 and Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route for many Indigenous peoples for centuries. By acknowledging this territory, we respect the histories, the languages, and cultures of First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada that enrich our vibrant communities. A treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. We are all treaty people, beneficiaries of the peace and prosperity the treaty brought, and committed also to working toward the equity and justice the treaty promised. May recognizing your status as treaty people help us to be good neighbors to one another, good stewards of the land, and good ancestors to our children. So just to get on to the main event and why you've all signed up today, so we'll just go to our next slide. We'll begin our time today with a panel discussion in response to a few questions we've prepared for our guests today. Afterwards, we'll open up the session to questions from the audience, so you might have to hold tight, but please don't hold your questions. Put them in the chat. That's where we're going to have you share the questions that you have for our panelists. We will pose those questions directly to our panelists during our Q&A period. So as I mentioned, don't hold on to your questions. Feel free to post them as our panelists are sharing their experiences and expertise. So many of you on the call today know the Evaluation Capacity Network, but there may be some who do not. So I'm just going to take a brief moment to tell you a bit about the network and then introduce you to our panelists that have joined us today. So the ECN, that's our short name, is an interdisciplinary and intersectoral network. We're housed within the Community University Partnership for the Study of Children, Youth, and Families, fondly known as CUP, in the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. So we support individuals and organizations across our municipality, our province, and also across Canada with research and evaluation. The requests we get can range anywhere from needing the support of a graduate student, having a conversation about evaluation and evaluation needs, helping to build an evaluation plan, evaluation capacity in an organization, or taking on an evaluation or a large initiative, and of course, everything in between. So today's session is a way for us to bring attention and discussion to a topic that is relevant and very important to our current partnerships with the many communities that we work, and that is culturally responsive and equitable evaluation. So I'm really pleased to welcome Drs. Ayesha Boyce, Jill Chouinard, and Yvonne Chiu to help us consider and critically reflect on our work in this area. So Ayesha Boyce, she's just been spotlighted on the screen. She's an associate professor at Arizona State University and an adjunct associate professor at UNC Greensboro. She also co-directs the STEM program Evaluation Lab. Ayesha's scholarship focuses on attending to value stances and issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, access, cultural responsiveness, and social justice within evaluation, especially multi-site STEM and context with historically marginalized populations. She's evaluated more than 55 programs funded by the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Education, National Institutes of Health, and Spencer and Teagle Foundations. So welcome, Ayesha. Jill Chouinard is our next panelist, and she's an associate professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria. She's assuming the role of editor-in-chief for the Canadian Journal of Program Evaluation. Her interdisciplinary scholarship informs her interest in culture and in issues of inequity and social justice. Jill's main research areas are in culturally responsive approaches to research and evaluation, participatory research and evaluation in public policy. Much of her evaluation work has been conducted in culturally and socially diverse community settings, excuse me, where she has extensive experience leading evaluations at the community level. Welcome, Jill. And our finalist, I feel like we're on a game show here. Yvonne Chiu is one of the co-founders and the executive director of the Multicultural Health Brokers Cooperative, a unique immigrant-led and award-winning workers cooperative. Her work has focused on revealing the realities, struggles, strengths, and aspirations of immigrants, refugees, and other newcomers for the purpose of affecting program policy and practice shifts. Yvonne is passionate about making visible and sharing with others the tacit knowledge generated at the grassroots by immigrant, refugee, and newcomer families, natural leaders, and the multicultural health brokers regarding the true nature of social inclusion and interculturalism. So join me in welcoming our panelists today. Okay, so we're going to get on to the main event here. I think I already kind of went over this next slide, but just our roadmap is that I'm going to pose some questions to our panelists, and we're going to get to hear a lot about their expertise and their experiences working in this space. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So again, as I mentioned, put all of your questions in the chat. Okay, so let's get started. This is why you came here today. So the first question that I would like to pose to our panelists is, what is your positionality in the context of this work? So, you know, we'll start off light here, right? So Ayesha, I'm hoping that you could start us off with answering that question.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here with you all. I'd like to just briefly start with my own land and labor acknowledgement. I acknowledge the 22 Native nations that have inhabited Arizona for centuries. Arizona State University's campuses are located in the Salt River Valley of ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Pima and Maricopa Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. I also acknowledge the labor of enslaved Africans and forced labor of people of Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Asian descent. We are indebted to their labor and their unwilling sacrifice, and we must acknowledge the tremors of violence throughout the generations and resulting impact of generational trauma that is still felt and witnessed today. So I wanted to start off with that. So in terms of my own positionality, I identify as a cisgender woman. I am Black and Latina descent. I'm a US citizen. I'm a mother, a wife, and a sister. And so my own positionality to this work is that I see advocacy and social justice as part of the very fabric of my being. I see it as a moral imperative. And for me, I believe that it's important that when conducting evaluation that we are responsive to the culture, context, and politics, and that ultimately we need to be lifting up the lived experiences of those who are often least well heard. And while there is a moral imperative to do this work, practically, it increases kind of the trustworthiness and validity of the work that we do. And that's why I believe that it's important. That's the positionality that I bring.
Great, thank you, Ayesha. So maybe we'll pass it over to Jill.
Okay, great, thanks. So I want to acknowledge with respect that I'm on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, and also on the Songhe, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples whose relationship continues on this land. In terms of my positionality, I just want to begin by recognizing that my ethnicity and my privilege. And I also recognize that as a white person, I bring these two things to every context and every evaluation that I'm in, whether or not they're ever talked about. Henry Giroux says that whiteness as an ethnic category secures its dominance by appearing to be invisible. And I note this as something that I take very seriously in my work. I also see knowledge and culture as something that is as two things that are deeply interconnected and very much tied to power, voice, and language. So at the end of the day, I'd say that my perspective is fundamentally quite political, especially as I realize that inclusion or having a seat at the table is really not enough. We need to be able to address the issues that cause or sustain these exclusions in the first place. So for me, my approach and my positionality is really about decolonizing evaluation practice. That's it.
Wonderful, thank you, Jill. And Yvonne.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Everyone, as you heard a little bit of the introduction about myself, I am really the humble practitioner among my esteemed researcher colleagues. So I am part of a very grassroots organization created by ethnocultural community members for their own community. And we happen to take up this practice of cultural brokering, an anthropological practice that is so needed in any society that's pluralistic and diverse. And so I would say, just being a humble member, a practitioner, what I have seen culturally responsive and equitable evaluation falls in three domains of relationship. It could be done by the people for the people, meaning our own community doing evaluation. It could be an intermediary organization like ourselves doing evaluating our action to improve on the life condition of the people we serve. But often we are also partners with colleagues who are in organization or government doing evaluation on their program to serve our population. So, so really, we often think about for this particular evaluation, it's by whom and for whom. And ultimately, I really believe that it's about engendering the best relationship for us to work, no matter where we are in the domains to evaluate action, that it's really, it must be context-based, it must be relational, and ultimately, like my two other colleagues have mentioned, it's about creating a much needed change, which is transformative. So that would be my quick summary of my positionality. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you so much for all sharing kind of how you position yourself in this work. And you, of course, have also alluded to why you engage in this work, because they're definitely connected. Yvonne, I'm hoping you can share with us just a little bit more about why you engage in this work.
Rebecca, truly, you know, it's been almost 30 years since I've been with my colleagues on the ground and doing the cultural brokering work. You know, I'm sad to say, while there's a lot of interest in racialized population, I don't think the truth of their exclusion is well understood. And so it becomes very important. One of the key principles is that our evaluation work is about revealing the truth of inequities. It is about an aspirational principle of reimagining how systems can be different in honor of diversity and the people. And back to this idea of relationship, another principle is true community engagement, where there is deep honoring of the people and that they lead us in the work that we do and that we evaluate based on their experience and perspective. So true community engagement that's authentic, that's driving the movement would be a really key principle. And then ultimately, because if it's relational, then we cannot go forward without the principles of trust and mutual appreciation. So those might be the key principles that I think would be very important.
Yvonne, you're jumping ahead to one of my other questions. I'm teasing you. So Ayesha, would you like to share with us why you engage in this work?
Sure. As I mentioned before, I believe that engaging in social justice is just a part of who I am, especially as a Black woman living in the United States. I have many identities of privilege. I also have identities of oppression, but ultimately it's part of who I am. Thomas and Madison in 2010 have said that, you know, as evaluators, we must be inspired to challenge the status quo, to care about the interests of the disadvantaged, and to uncover weaknesses within the system that contribute to inequities within society. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think that speaks to who I am as a professional and who I am as a person. I think that evaluation should be more than a technical endeavor. And part of our role is to uncover these truths and to really be thoughtful about the ways in which our work can and should challenge and change systems.
Great. Thank you, Ayesha, for sharing that. And we'll move on to Jill. Why do you engage in this work?
Yeah, I think a lot of my why is also reflected in my positionality statement. But I'll just tell a short little story to illustrate a point that I want to make. And this is really my why. In a recent trip before the pandemic in Costa Rica, my husband and I met a shaman, a medicine man, and he told us that he had spent over 25 years honing his craft and learning the ways of the forest and which barks, et cetera, to cure which illnesses, from babyhood all the way up to death. And then he showed us his medicine cabinet, which was really a series of barks and salves from the forest. And I was thinking the whole time, like, comparing this to our world is so completely different. And then I thought, yeah, like think about an operating theater in a big urban center and just that juxtaposition. And so then I started thinking about the Western canon. And our Western canon, which represents, we're all recipients of the Western canon. We've all been educated in the Western canon. And it essentially represents our storehouse of knowledge. It's a cultural archive that classifies, identifies, and it categorizes, and it ultimately determines what's considered legitimate knowledge. And it frames the parameters of knowledge, and it becomes the standard by which we judge, measure, and value people, pretty well everything in our society. So if you want to just flip the slide over. Yeah, and if you take a look at the picture of the Western canon, you can see that there's not a lot of representation in that Western canon. And yet, I mean, I'm not there. Many of us on the panel are not there. In fact, I don't think we're there. And so I think about that this is essentially this canon that has framed the university system, our sciences, our literatures, et cetera. And these are the things that we use to determine what's legitimate knowledge and what's not legitimate knowledge. And it just doesn't reflect the population of the world. So I feel a really deep sort of moral and ethical responsibility for what some have called cognitive justice. So it's acknowledging that there's a plurality of different knowledges in the world, and not just one sort of perspective. So I think that's really what propels me to do the work that I do, to teach what I teach, and to do the writing that I do, all in service to a more just, equitable, and humane world.
Thank you, Jill. I think we'll skip forward to our next question. So, you know, Yvonne was alluding to this. This is very much a principled approach to evaluation. And so there's some obviously foundational principles that guide your work in culturally responsive and equitable evaluation. And I'd like to hear a little bit about that. Jill, I'm wondering if you wanted to start us off.
Yeah, for sure. So as someone who's privileged in our society and as someone who's been educated in our colonial system, I feel a deep sense of responsibility and an ethical commitment to principles of equity, anti-racism, justice, epistemological justice. So making sure that other perspectives and voices are heard, collaboration, ensuring a breadth of perspective, and constantly being critical about things that are given, and constantly questioning what the parameters are that we can work within, and really always trying to push those parameters. So I know that you're seeing a lot of words and a lot of concepts thrown on the slide, but for me, they really are what guide me in the work that I do.
Thank you, Jill. So Yvonne, you had alluded to many principles before about why you engage in this work and even your positionality around this work. And can you share more of that with us?
Thank you, Rebecca. I did answer the question earlier. Hey, everyone, I would say in our everyday work, being part of the ethnocultural community, we are truly witnessing system to system social and economic exclusion. And what is really troublesome is that the lived experience of those who are excluded are not truly deeply understood. So which makes, shall we say, designing and implementing efforts and then evaluating those efforts a little bit disappointing. And so my hope is that we really seek to go forward. If we all ground our culturally responsive and equitable evaluation on the principle of justice and inclusion, it will be a very different experience for all. It means that we are not only conscious of who we are in our positioning, but truly understand those for whom change is so desired. And so I know my two other colleagues have spoke a lot about systemic changes and how we might actually still exist a paradigm where there's obviously a dominant way of being that is implicitly influencing us. So my deepest hope in terms of principle is more than social justice, social inclusion, and transformation. It's really a deep desire for all of us to get to know each other as part of shared humanity. And from that knowledge and that relationship, design work and evaluation towards not only to change the other, it's mostly to change ourselves for the sake of ultimate fundamental shifts. And so it does require us critically look at social structures in how, in an everyday way, it's not truly just, nor mutual, nor reciprocal. And so I truly hope that we will find, the anchoring for our work that is really deeply rooted in relationship of egalitarian desire for change. And so, hopefully that is making a little bit more sense, from our experience of evaluation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Ayesha, would you like to share some of the principles that guide your work?
Sure. I think I agree with much of what my colleagues have on this panel have already said. What I'll add is that as evaluators, we have a tendency to be, as all professionals have the tendency to be siloed in our own work. We're so focused on, well, what are other evaluators talking about? And I have to give Jill credit for this. One thing that I tried to do is really expand my understanding and my knowledge outside of the realm of evaluation. So looking at higher education, looking at what historians have said, right? To really deepen my understanding of the context in which I work, and so a lot of this has to do with me taking on this educative role. So me educating others about what evaluation can and should be, but also me educating myself about historically and having a deeper sense of what's going on. And when I say, understanding the historical context, I mean things that have happened years and years ago and things that have happened recently, right? I think I would be remiss if I sat on this panel and didn't acknowledge the close to a dozen Black lives that were killed and murdered in Buffalo just a few days ago. And so I think all of these things ultimately impact the work that we do and impact the world that we live in. You know, evaluation doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so making sure that we acknowledge and engage with these current events, as well as, you know, some of the other items that I have here on the slide as well.
Thank you so much, Ayesha. And kind of a nice segue to the next question is this work is deeply contextual. It is, you know, there is huge histories, both recent and past, that you have to really, you know, understand in order to sort of have an appreciation in this work. And it's challenging work. This is probably, you know, what everybody really wants to hear about is why do you continue to engage in it? Because it is really complex, challenging work, but incredibly rewarding. So I'm wondering, you know, maybe Ayesha, you could keep us going and share some of your experiences with us about the challenges you've experienced and maybe how you've ever overcome them in your work.
Sure.
Not that you can, but
Sure. I
overcome
mean,
everything.
as many have alluded to, I mean, this work really is context specific. A lot of this work has to do with building relationships with all of those who have stake in the evaluation, from participants to community members to those who have the potential to benefit or from the evaluation, ultimately funders. And that can be really difficult. I think for me, oftentimes some of the most difficult or challenging aspect of this work is that it takes time. And that's something that sometimes, you know, as evaluators, we're kind of bound to these very tight timelines. And so I think for me, that oftentimes can be very difficult. I think also developing credibility. I work in a context with mostly kind of scientists and engineers and people who I would say their positionality and their worldviews are probably slightly different than mine. They might put themselves in different kind of ontological and epistemological places. And so sometimes that can be really different, and meaning that what they believe ultimately is truth or what they believe counts as knowledge might be very different. They may come to me and say, okay, how many people did this? I'm interested in, you know, diversity numbers. And oftentimes, especially when we talk about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, people kind of lump those terms all together. But ultimately, diversity is one thing, equity is one thing, and inclusivity is one thing. And so if I've had experiences where my, you know, funders or my clients will say, okay, well, how many people, you know, oh, we increased numbers. We increased this many, you know, numbers of Latino students who came into this program. And then I have to say, yes, that's really great. And that's a great first stop. But we also have to see, do they feel like they belong here? I've had instances where I've had students from various backgrounds having a different experience than their white peers. And so sometimes it can be really challenging to break that news in a way that the clients can receive it, but then also kind of making sure that we're able to follow up on those results. So I'll give a really quick story. One time with a client, we found that the graduate students who were not white were having a slightly different experience than those who were white. And so the client said to me, oh, well, this is probably ultimately because students who aren't white don't have a good of understanding of what it means to be a graduate student. Like they don't come with a prior knowledge of what it's going to mean to be a graduate student. So what we should do is we should take more time to educate our non-white students. I'm paraphrasing here. And so I said, wow, that's a really interesting perspective. But also that's a very deficit perspective. Like there's something wrong with these students, which is why they're having this experience. And ultimately that wasn't what was happening. They were having a less positive experience for a different reason. And so what I mean is I didn't just say, that's a racist. Like there's no way that you can understand what's going on. It's like part of it is building relationships and building this credibility to say, and having the ability to push back on sometimes some of the values and some of the initial interpretations and say, well, I provided you with this data, but now we have to dig deeper. And that's going to take more time. That's going to take more resources. And sometimes that's, you know, when you're in this time-bound or resource-bound capitalistic society, that can be really difficult. And so that's just one example of some of the challenges, but I'm committed to doing this. And so sometimes that also means, okay, well, I have to take a little bit of extra of my own time to figure out like why something's happening or to follow up on results so I can provide a complete and full story to my clients.
Thank you, Ayesha, for sharing your experiences and also those kind of tangible examples in our work and not making assumptions about the data we get, right, and the interpretations we make. Yvonne, would you like to share with us the challenges and the rewards and what you experience in your work?
Thank you, Rebecca. Everyone, as you remember, I mentioned that the way we experience culturally responsive and equitable evaluation is through relationship with three domains. Eh? And so being the intermediaries in much of our work, of course, you know, I echo my two other colleagues. It's so much about relationship and really context-based work. And so, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, in many instances between the three domains, the very people for whom we're seeking to create change, and perhaps those of us who are activating programs and evaluate programs, we still have a bit of a relational and knowledge gap between each other. And so that has been very often very challenging. That's something I wish we could all figure out. How could we truly build the kind of mutual relationship and understanding when the evaluation involve stakeholders from the community as well as from those outside of the community. And implicitly, there would be some degree of power disparity in any of this kind of evaluation work or a program design and measurement work. And so, you know, in the past, we would jointly develop relational agreement to make sure perhaps the very people for whom we're creating change hold the most power and they're leading and guiding us, right? And of course, we all know we lived in systems and probably currently operate in systems. Sometimes the evaluation require, as we said earlier, systemic changes. But in our experience of looking at system change, it's not easy. System has its own nature of perpetuating itself. So these kind of challenges, I'm sure everybody have experienced, and it's not easy to overcome. And I do feel like what keeps us all going is truly our love for the people and our belief in social justice. So I think we all have a degree of relentlessness, hey? And so I don't know how long each of our careers might be. I'm very old and ancient now, but I think being committed, having companions, having others in this community of practice is really key. Because we can then continue to build on what we have learned and making sure that the continuity happens, that others are really benefiting from what we've learned. But maybe most importantly, for the very people in the population we wish to see change, we must take on a Paulo Freire's approach. Eh? We must build their capacity to have strong resistance power, to create change and measure change for themselves and by themselves. And I think that is truly the future of our work. And so it's transformative in the sense of can we support the very people to create the change and help them, support them to measure the change according to who they are. That might be really, really important. I did include a slide after this, and everyone, sorry, it's very lots of text, but maybe just go for the key feature of this. It kind of echoes what Jill said in the beginning. In our work, all of our collective work, we are actually facing the existence of two paradigms, a dominant way of being and a subdominant way of being. And usually we're trying to create change using culturally responsive practice and evaluation with the subordinate side. And unfortunately, this paradigm isn't still very clear to all of us. And the way of being on in those two paradigms among ourselves are very different. And to respect and recognize the side that is a subordinate entity is really important, but to be explicitly understanding how we behave, how we look at knowledge, how we relate to each other is also very important to create the change that we all desire. So hopefully this a bit of a complex visual is giving a bit of sense of some essential elements. Hey, so thank you, everyone. This is where I'm going to stop for this question. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Maybe Jill can pick up where you stopped, and she can share her her experiences.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. We all interpreted this question slightly differently. And yet I think what we have to say really does overlap and connect really quite nicely. But in thinking about this question, just because of the nature of the work, I think there are a lot of challenges. So these are the kind of a couple of challenges that came to mind for me. One of them is that with culturally responsive research and evaluation, we're always coming across these institutional or historical barriers. Right now, we're living in a governance system that's very much fixated on reducing everything to quantitative, quantifiable metrics. And it's a very kind of indicator heavy, crazy kind of world. And if you look at and work with small organizations and nonprofit organizations, the kinds of metrics that they need to complete, and that's considered evaluation, are really kind of crazy. And when you look at them, they're really reductive, and they're really not capturing the essence of the work. And so I think from a culturally responsive or a collaborative perspective, we end up, when we do this work, we end up having to satisfy or balance the needs of what the funder is requesting from the organization, their accountability measures, with doing the work that really matters and will resonate with the community. And they tend to be quite different. And the reality is, we're not reducing the number of indicators. It's becoming more and more. So I just feel that the tension between the indicator heaviness, I don't know what to call it, and culturally responsive or social justice, equity oriented approaches is in tension. So that's kind of one of them. And that's a challenge. I don't know if it's a challenge or it's a conundrum or it's something. It's a dilemma, but it's definitely something that we come across in our work. And then the other one for me is this, I don't know what to call it. I'm calling it like epistemological ecology or something, that in our work, we tend to focus on the individual, and we tend to focus on capacity building and training and the provision of services. And all of that makes sense, right? And our measures in that sense tend to be quite local. And yet for me, I mean, think about the Western canon I alluded to. That for me, that the bigger challenge is this macro historical piece that Yvonne mentioned. It's the fundamental challenge to the work that we're doing. And it provides those systemic barriers and challenges that maintain the current status quo. So we're working at one level, making change, if you think of it more locally, and yet there are these systems that are quite massive and large that are constantly influencing and informing and shaping that system. So again, there's this constant tension. And then, so no answer, just pointing that out there. And then the other challenge for me is working as someone who's privileged and who's white. I work in communities with people whose life experiences are very different from my own. And the challenges that they're experiencing are historical, but they're ongoing. And I mean, Ayesha mentioned the Tops shooting as an example of this fundamentally extraordinarily racist and hatred. And I'm working in that as a white person, and I'm trying to work in good faith to create this more equitable understanding. But it's how do you build trust when the issues they're not from the past, they're current. And so for me, there's the challenges of building that, of trying to understand how am I, what's the best way for me to position myself to be an ally, right? And the fourth challenge is, it's really more of a question, but and definitely no answer on this one, but is the question about that Audrey Lord asks: can the master's tools ever dismantle the master's house? And I ask that because evaluation is itself a colonizing practice, okay? And we've been trained as evaluators in a way of thinking, okay, in a system of a social science, right? That's part of the academy. And so I wonder, are we trying to do something with evaluation or with research that it's not designed to do. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jill. Well, you've left us with a question to the audience, perhaps. Very provocative. I want to thank all of you for joining us. So Yvonne, Jill, and Ayesha, and just sharing your experiences, examples from your work, and really adding to this discussion today. I really appreciate how patient our audience has been. Some of them, there's been some chatter, I see that. But we would like to open it up and invite people now to pop in your questions. We've been jotting them down and really open it up for discussion now. So if you have questions as this unfolds, please pop them in the chat. There's no need to raise your hand because we're kind of documenting it. So I'm just going to move through to asking some of these questions. We've got about, I'd say, over 15 minutes to kind of ask a few questions. So the first question is, I think it's directed at you, Yvonne, but of course we'll open it up to our entire panel. Yvonne, you've touched on this a little bit, but how do we incorporate culturally responsive and equitable evaluation in a very bureaucratic organization such as government, which has an existing system and maybe resistance to change? And there's kind of a follow-up to that question. You know, and for the panel, do we have any success stories on influencing an existing system, such as government, to be more progressive, such as incorporating culturally responsive and equitable evaluation?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I will give it a try, and everyone please join in. You know, quite honestly, because I am part of the ethnocultural community in Edmonton, actually government had gone through different stages of paying attention or interested in this population. And so in the last 30 years that I've been in my career, you know, there had been major dips and no interest in the ethnocultural communities. But lately, given COVID, given Black Lives Matter, there is interest again. So for me, being a practitioner, so much is influenced by government's own attentiveness and interest to our population. And when there's interest, there is a chance that we could truly encourage the creation of culturally responsive and equitable evaluation. But with that too, as we discussed earlier in this lunch hour, there's so many elements of relational work, about power disparity, about a sense of radicalness, taking on a critical stance in engaging in evaluation. That I don't think we ourselves have done enough to say how it's going to work. It's also relational if we happen to be partnering with a colleague who is very much aligned with these principles and values and pretty high up in the hierarchy, then often there's much more success. But as you know, in any systems, the leadership that maybe really resonate with the principle of equity and justice are not always there. And therefore, again, as I mentioned, why we need relentlessness, because the very people that has some influence change. We haven't yet found a way to institutionalize this kind of practice, right? So, so to the colleague who brought the question, I hope I kind of answered it. And in terms of successes that we have, I would say the success we have would have been with a public institution in Edmonton, because we have the perfect alignment of visionary leaders. And in this public institution, you have regional leadership, you have neighborhood-based leadership, and it happened to be aligned, you know, and the governance. And so we had 12 years of success, but because that public institution was funded by government, almost overnight, because the funding shifted, it just didn't allow us to carry on the programming or the evaluation, because that public institution needed to shift their priorities. So, so that would be an example. Yeah.
And I'll open it up to Ayesha and Jill, if you have anything to add to that. And
Yeah, can I just say something? So I've done a number of different contracts with the federal government, not the provincial government here in BC. And I think and this is an example again of the individual versus the system. I think that it depends on the leadership. And if the leadership is keen on having an equitable, more collaborative approach to the work that you're doing, you can bring it in. And they might not have a definition of what that means. And I think that becomes a kind of a moment of education for us, where we can have really good dialogue with that leadership. But there's a lot of change in government. And so people come and go. And so a decade later, you might have the same department coming to you and saying, hey, do you want to do an evaluation? And you're right back at square one. So the systems are still in place that maintain the regular kind of way of doing business versus, doing a more equitable approach. But that said, I've just been engaged with a large federal government department, and it is really to decolonize the way that they're doing evaluation in that institution. So again, though, that's leadership, right? So who knows in 10 years what that's going to look like, because the systems themselves are still there.
Thank you, Jill. It's a nice segue because there's a couple questions kind of dancing around that funding piece. How can funders help address these challenges? And do you have any strategies that you've used in your work around that kind of power sharing when you've got, funders, community members in an evaluation context, and maybe, really kind of different outcomes that they're expecting out of this work?
Yeah, I'll cite an example. Here in Edmonton, our city with the FCSS funding had made it very explicit in this current time of, putting emphasis on the principle of social inclusion and the principles of equity. It's true. If funders also take on a critical stance, then it encourages those who are funded to pursue practice in such a way. And so I think funders have a lot to do with it. Yeah.
I agree. I saw this great conversation that's happening over on LinkedIn. I put the link in the chat, but Dr. Vidya Shankar had shared this really great infographic, which talked about where bias happens in grant making, and talking about the grant program cycle, which ultimately speaks to not just who gets funding, but ultimately what type of topics are prioritized in funding. I work with funding agencies here in the United States, especially the National Science Foundation, and what gets posted in those requests for proposals, this is a case here and everywhere, is really important in terms of what those who are seeking funding gets funded, but also it really shapes the conversation about what's happening. I mean, what I think is important versus what someone could get $1 million for studying thinks is important are vastly, vastly different. And so being thoughtful about not just who gets the money, but how the priorities for funding are set, who ultimately is invited to apply, and also who's reviewing those funding proposals. So I think there's a lot that funders can do from the inception of an idea about what should get funded all the way to ultimately taking a look at who gets funding.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We have a lot of questions coming in, and I do appreciate sharing those links in the chat as well. So this is a question around colonizing. Is all evaluation framed as a colonizing practice? And I think, Jill, you made that comment earlier, so I'll maybe ask if you can respond to that.
Yeah, I thought I saw that. Is that Michelle? Good one. Well, in fact, but so is our practice, right? So is culturally responsive practice. We're still using the ways of thinking, the ways of framing problems, the ways of having problem analysis, the whole structure of our thinking and of our way of thinking, no matter what approaches we use. So we can use arts-based, we can use plays, I try to use like as many different tactile things, especially working with youth. But at the end of the day, it's still being brought to answer a question. It's still being framed in a certain way. Now, is there a way around that? I have no idea. I have no idea. At the Canadian Journal, I can say, I don't know that Nikki's on here now, but Nikki and Larry have started an Indigenous section of the journal, and they're looking at how to do the review section, how to have reviewers, right? This is because the way we do reviews is so problematic in so many ways for so many people, okay? And so they're looking at that. And I was saying to Isabel, like, it's like standing back and watching, how do you decolonize this practice? Because it's fundamentally a very colonizing practice. So is it going to be possible? I mean, it's something that, I think we're always playing with it. But there's a lot of literature on, whether post-colonialism is really can post-colonialism really be post, are all these, post-structuralism and all these different theoretical approaches, are they just really part of the whole Western canon? Because they're still part of the body of knowledge. So I don't necessarily have an answer to that. Do you? Do either of the panelists?
They're staying silent, Jill.
I mean, I think this goes back to the Audre Lorde quote, right? I mean, I think it's really difficult because, I've even had people talk to me and help me be reflective about my role in doing this work as someone who works in academia versus someone who works for the government versus someone who works as an independent evaluator. And so I don't know. I think part of what our jobs are to do is to bring up these issues. And some people would say, oh, you're just moving the needle, which is doing nothing. And others would say, well, we have to tear down the systems. And others would say we have to, work within the systems, but be in a little bit of a subversive nature. And so I'm still exploring this, I guess is what I'm saying. I still struggle with this in terms of like, how much can I do? How much can I push? And how much can I change the system I work in, while with the recognition that I work in a system that is riddled with classism and racism and lots of other isms. And so me, by being here in my role, in some ways is fighting against it, but in other ways upholds the system itself. And so I think there is no easy answer in this. This is something that I continuously grapple with.
Yeah, because we're benefiting from the system. We're part of the system. We're benefiting from the system, and yet we're fighting the system.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, Rebecca, this is something the organization can do, right? The evaluation capacity building network. This could be an area we can really work on, to tackle some of the practice issues that we raise. And I looked at my dear colleagues' comments in the chat. It is revealing it's an area that there is deep desire for figuring out how this could be done as evaluators.
Yeah, absolutely, Yvonne. I mean, just the sheer interest in the conversation today, right? And we really see this. We talked a lot about this as a teaser or the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more conversation to have, and and we're excited that so many people showed up, because I think that invites you to this conversation, and we're looking to kind of problem solve this together and bump into our challenges and work together. I've got time for a couple more questions. I know they won't all get answered today, but again, we're opening a dialogue here today, and we hope to continue that dialogue. So in terms of somebody made the comment, as a non-specialist in this area, I've been struck by the complexity of the language used. I'm wondering if this also creates barriers which simplicity could help break down.
Oh, I have so many thoughts about this, especially as someone who sits in academia. We were just talking about this and I think this also a little bit speaks to, is in parallel to Tim's comment in the chat, this idea that when we use terms like decolonization is not the same thing as attending to DEI, is not the same thing as looking at issues of anti-racism and white supremacy, although they all kind of sit within this umbrella of social justice. And I think it can be difficult because oftentimes we're talking past each other, and when we use certain terminology or certain jargon, but then also what we mean, we're not, but then there's really specific languages. I think that's also really important because we're not actually talking about the same thing. So when I say DEI, I'm not actually using it as a proxy, which is Tim's point, as a proxy to talking about white supremacy and anti-racism. Whereas when others use the term DEI, that's exactly what they're doing. And so it's hard because you do in some ways want there to be a simplification and a more kind of accessible language, but then there also is something about the usefulness of specificity in terms of what it is that we're actually talking about. So that's not an answer, except for I agree that this makes things very convoluted, and sometimes like when we're talking, we can be very esoteric. We're like, what are you talking about? Why are you using this jargon? Is there a way to say this more simply? And the answer is yes, but then maybe the complexity of what we're actually talking about sometimes can get washed away in that as well.
Yeah, and can I just say, in my dissertation, one of the people that I interviewed, she said to me, and I never forgot this point. Well, it wasn't that long ago, but I still haven't forgotten it, is that we do part of evaluation is analysis. So we as educators, as evaluators, we're all about analysis, right? We're all about collecting data and analyzing it and answering an evaluation question. But for a lot of people, even if they've drawn pictures, even if they've engaged in the practice in a different way, sitting them around a table and analyzing and deconstructing something, that's not something they want to do. You know, that's not something that there's a natural inclination to do. But we think that, you know, because we do, and it's part of our work, that if we have participants around a table, that they're going to want to do these things. But I think it's not just the words, it's the concepts themselves that I think can be really challenging too. And I don't mean that in a negative, pejorative way in the slightest. You know, this is the work we do, so we analyze. But a lot of people do not live like that.
Thank you so much. I'm recognizing the time. We're creeping up on that 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. I know many of you are joining us. It's later in your day or earlier in your day. But I did want to thank Jill, Yvonne, and Ayesha for sharing their insights with us today, for all of our audience members that joined us and asked incredibly thoughtful questions. And there was a lot of information shared in there as well. So we'll make sure that we capture that and get that sent out. There's a lot for us to think about and continue a dialogue around in this work. So as I mentioned, it's a teaser, so stay tuned. We'll keep the conversation going. The slide deck and the video recording will be shared to your email within the next week. So keep your eye out for that. We would love to get your feedback and ideas for future sessions. So we kindly ask, we do have a link that's going to be in the chat to complete an evaluation survey. We'll also send that out in an email as well. So I did want to remind you, we do have a follow-up lunch and learn session that's taking place in 10 days on May 26th. And there we're going to really explore some community-driven and capacity building initiatives that the network is involved in. And you can hear from some local initiatives and also some national initiatives. So we encourage you to come. So again, a warm round of applause to our panelists. I don't know if anybody, because I'm not sure if they can show their emojis or not, but I'll do it on behalf of everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we do have a list of resources we'll be sure to send out in an email as well as in the chat today. So on that note, I think this is our final piece. But again, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.